October 27th, 1943, 10:30 in the morning. Mono Island, Treasury Islands, Solomon Islands. The air above the beach had already been claimed by the dead. The smell of cordite drifted through the wet tropical heat, that heavy, suffocating warmth that pressed against a man's lungs like a soaked blanket. Coconut palms, shredded to ragged stumps by days of naval bombardment, stood along the shoreline like broken sentinels. The sand was dark in places where men had fallen hours before, and the jungle wall behind the beach crackled without ceasing under the rhythm of small arms fire. The New Zealand 8th Brigade had come ashore in the first waves of Operation Good Time, the Allied seizure of the Treasury Islands, and it had expected to move. It had not moved. Somewhere ahead, buried inside a fortress of palm logs and compacted sand, a Japanese pillbox had become a wall no bullet could break. It sat low to the ground, angular and invisible until it spoke. And when it spoke with machine guns. It did not need to see the men it killed. It simply poured fire into the approaches, into the open, into any vector the New Zealanders attempted to push through. The advance had stalled on this stretch of beach for reasons that would have been familiar to every soldier who had come ashore on a Pacific island since 1942. A fortification that bullets could not kill, manned by men who did not intend to leave it alive. And then a sound came from behind the beach. A deep, mechanical rumble, low and steady and entirely unlike anything a soldier was trained to fear. Not artillery. Not the whistle of a mortar round. Something else. Something that did not rush. Something that moved with the unhurried confidence of a thing that had never learned it was supposed to be afraid. It was a Caterpillar D8 bulldozer. 24 tons of diesel-powered American iron. And the man sitting behind its controls, is wearing a Navy uniform rather than a soldier's kit, was machinist's mate 2nd Class Aurelio Tassone of Milford, Massachusetts, Company A, Naval Construction Battalion 87. He had given his bulldozer a name. He had called her Helen after his wife. And on this morning, inside a pillbox made of logs and packed earth, 12 Japanese soldiers were about to discover what it meant to be on the wrong side of the American industrial century. Yet to understand the magnitude of what was about to happen on that beach, what it meant not only militarily but philosophically, culturally, and in the deepest architecture of the human will, it is necessary to look back. Not far back, but far enough to understand the world these two forces had built before they collided. Japan went to war in 1941 carrying something more than rifles and artillery. It carried an idea, a deep, scaffolded system of belief about the nature of the warrior, the sanctity of the Japanese state, and the relationship between death and honor. This idea had been centuries in the building. Its roots ran down through the feudal samurai traditions of medieval Japan, through the Meiji Restoration of the 1860s and 1870s, through the militarist governments of the 1930s that had taken those traditions and forged them, in the intense heat of nationalism, into something new and terrible. And by the time Japanese soldiers were boarding transport ships to the islands of the Pacific, they carried within them a belief system so total, so immersive, so reinforced by everything they had ever been taught about duty and death and the meaning of existence, that it had become less an ideology than a physical fact of the world. The document that codified this belief most precisely was the Senjin-kun, the Imperial Japanese Army Field Service Code, promulgated on January 8, 1941, by War Minister Hideki Tojo. The Senjin-kun addressed the soldier not merely as a fighter, but as a sacred agent of the emperor, a living embodiment of Kokutai, the unique national spirit that made Japan not merely a country, but a divine institution. The code was explicit on the question of surrender. It did not hedge. It did not allow for circumstance or nuance. Never live to experience shame as a prisoner, the code declared. Retreat was dishonor. A capture was a kind of spiritual annihilation far worse than death. The concept of gyokusai, literally shattering like a jewel, described the ideal of dying in battle rather than surrendering, dying beautifully, as a jewel shatters rather than merely breaking. It was an aesthetic of self-destruction, a philosophy in which the act of dying in service to the emperor was not a tragedy, but a consummation. Japanese soldiers were told that their American enemies were soft, uncorrupted by commerce and comfort, weakened by democracy, which by definition could not produce true warriors, because democracy allowed men to think of themselves before the state. The American soldier, Japanese propaganda insisted, would not fight with the fanatical intensity of a man willing to die. The American soldier had things to lose: a house, a car, a wife, a future, and men with things to lose did not die well. American firepower might be significant, but American willpower would break. This belief was not simply propaganda, it was deeply felt. It had been confirmed in the minds of many Japanese officers by the early campaigns of the Pacific War, the fall of the Philippines, the capture of Singapore, the swift overrunning of Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. These early Japanese victories had seemed to validate the faith. The Western soldier had been shown to break. Speed, spirit, and the willingness to die had proven superior to technology and numbers. The Japanese army believed this, and the belief was not entirely without foundation. In the first year of the war, it had been correct. But the islands of the Pacific had a long memory, and 1942 was not 1941. By the time the Seabees, the United States Naval Construction Battalions, arrived in the Pacific, America had already begun to answer the question of what a democracy was truly capable of when it committed its full industrial weight to a single purpose. The Seabees had been formally established on March 5, 1942, under the command of Admiral Ben Moriel of the Bureau of Yards and Docks, a man his own men would come to call the King Bee. Their motto, hammered into Latin for the gravity it deserved, was Construimus Batuimus, we build, we fight. Their slogan, is shorter and more American in its confident brevity, was simply, can do. Nearly 325,000 men would eventually serve in the naval construction battalions. Many of them were not young men. The early Seabees had an average age of 37. They were iron workers, electricians, carpenters, heavy equipment operators, men who had spent the Depression years of the 1930s learning to build things under hard conditions, and men who had mastered the art of making something from nothing on New Deal construction projects and union job sites from California to Maine. When the war came, they brought those skills to the most inhospitable real estate on Earth: coral atolls, volcanic rock, malarial jungle, and they built on it anyway. Each CB construction battalion deployed into the Pacific equipped with a standard complement of Caterpillar heavy tractors. 8 Caterpillar D8s per battalion, 4 D7s, 4 D6s, so 2 D4s. The tractors came painted olive drab rather than Caterpillar yellow, but they ran on the same diesel engines, moved on the same steel tracks, and pushed the same weight of earth. And across Peoria, Illinois, at the Caterpillar Tractor Company's main plant, which won the Army-Navy E Award for production excellence 4 separate times during the war, the machines were coming off the assembly line in numbers Japan could not imagine. Between 1942 and the end of 1945, the Caterpillar alone produced 56,306 crawler tractors for the war effort. The D7 model, the workhorse of the Pacific Campaign, accounted for 20,503 of that total, fully 40% of everything Caterpillar built for the military during those 4 years. In April 1942, the United States War Production Board had designated that 85% of all crawler tractors produced in the country would go directly to military purposes. Should the entire weight of the American manufacturing economy, the same economy that produced 11 times more coal than Japan, 22 times more petroleum, 13 times more steel, was directed at this single imperative: not to win a battle, to reshape the earth itself, to turn jungle into airfield, reef into harbor, cave and bunker, and fortified hillside into rubble and memory. Admiral William Halsey, the man who had commanded the Pacific Fleet through some of its most critical engagements, was asked after the war to list the instruments that had done the most to win the Pacific campaign. His answer moved in a descending order of importance: submarines first, radar second, aircraft third, and then, fourth on the list of things that won the Pacific War, the bulldozer. General Dwight Eisenhower, reflecting on the European theater, placed the bulldozer alongside the Jeep, the 2.5-ton truck, and the C-47 transport plane as among the most vital weapons of the entire Allied war effort. These were not the assessments of sentimentalists or supply officers. They were the judgments of the men who had watched the war most closely, and they were pointing at something the history books rarely named. The Japanese military, with its philosophy of spirit over material, of willpower over industrial capacity, had no equivalent to what was coming ashore on their islands, the Treasury Islands. October 27, 1943. Lieutenant Charles Turnbull, commanding officer of Company A, Naval Construction Battalion 87, watched the advance of the New Zealand infantry falter and stop. The Japanese pillbox had been constructed with care. Heavy coconut logs reinforced with compacted earth and sand, positioned at an angle that gave its machine gun crew a wide field of fire across the beach approaches. It was, by any reasonable military assessment, in exactly the kind of fortification that was supposed to require artillery or demolition charges or a flanking movement supported by suppressive fire. It was a problem that, by the established calculus of Pacific warfare, was going to cost time and lives. Turnbull looked at the bulldozer idling behind the beach. He looked at Tassone in the operator's seat. He gave the order. What followed was something the 12 Japanese soldiers inside that pillbox could not have prepared for, because it did not exist in the military doctrines they had been trained on, and it did not exist in the landscape of threats that their ideology had taught them to recognize. Tassone raised the blade of the D8 until it formed a wall of steel between himself and the machine gun fire. He advanced at the speed the diesel engine permitted, not fast, not dramatic in the cinematic sense, just steady and relentless in the way that truly unstoppable things tend to be. But the bullets struck the raised blade and deflected harmlessly. The engine did not notice them. The tracks continued to turn. Turnbull moved behind and to the side of the dozer, directing fire from his carbine, providing what cover he could while the machine moved forward. When the blade reached the pillbox, Tassone lowered it. The fortification that had stopped an infantry brigade ceased to exist in the time it takes to draw a breath. The tons of earth and log that had been arranged to protect the Japanese soldiers were instead arranged on top of them. All 12 occupants of the pillbox were buried where they had been fighting. The machine gun went silent. The beach opened. The advance resumed. For this action, Aurelio Tassone and Charles Turnbull were each awarded the Silver Star. Tassone was promoted to machinist's mate first class. He became, in a very literal sense, a symbol, his story reproduced in recruiting posters, and his act of mechanical courage dramatized the following year in the 1944 film The Fighting Seabees, in which John Wayne, 37 years old and playing a construction worker turned warrior, reenacted for movie audiences what a man with a bulldozer could do on a Pacific beach. The story went home to America in the form of myth, but on the islands of the Pacific, it had not been myth. It had been engineering. Yet to the Japanese soldiers and officers who witnessed these encounters with American mechanized construction equipment, the experience produced a specific and difficult species of horror. Not the clean, comprehensible horror of being shelled or bombed. Those were weapons they understood. weapons that existed in a legible framework of combat, weapons against which a soldier could theoretically respond with courage or maneuvering or the spiritual resources of Bushido. The bulldozer was different. It was not a weapon in any traditional sense. It had no barrel, no trajectory, no projectile. It did not kill from a distance with the grace that death in battle was supposed to have. It simply moved earth, and it moved earth in quantities and with a consistency and at a speed that no army of human laborers, however well motivated, however spiritually prepared, could match. In the Japanese model of island defense, the soldier was the fortification. Yet the bunker existed as an extension of his will, reinforced by the depth of his commitment to die rather than yield. The underground network was an expression of spiritual endurance, proof that the Japanese warrior could out-persevere any enemy simply through the ferocity of his dedication to a fixed position. Japanese military engineers had spent months, in some cases more than a year, preparing the island defenses of the Central Pacific. They blasted limestone caves by hand and by drill. They reinforced entrances with logs and concrete. They connected positions with tunnels. They designed fields of fire to cover every approach. They embedded themselves in the earth so deeply that artillery could pass over them and they would survive. So that when the Americans came ashore, the Japanese would simply wait in the dark and bleed them on the surface. The tactical doctrine of General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the brilliant and clear-eyed commander who fortified Iwo Jima against the American assault of February 1945, represented the culmination of everything the Japanese military had learned about fighting the United States across 3 years of island combat. Kuribayashi had visited America. He had driven across it. He had sat at American dinner tables and watched Americans work and build and consume and manufacture. And he had returned to Japan carrying a private knowledge he could not entirely share with his superiors, that the country he had been sent to fight was producing weapons and material at a scale that defied the spiritual calculus of Bushido. His letters home were suffused with a soldier's love for his family and a commander's clear-eyed dread. He knew what was coming. He designed his defenses accordingly. At Iwo Jima, Kuribayashi ordered the construction of more than 18 kilometers of tunnels, some reports suggesting plans for as much as 27 kilometers when the invasion came. 5,000 individual caves were cut into the volcanic rock of the island. Bunkers were reinforced with steel and concrete. Firing positions were angled to eliminate dead zones. The entire island was engineered to become a machine for killing Americans at the greatest possible ratio. 1 Japanese soldier for 10 Americans. That was the command's stated objective, a final transaction of lives in which Japan could not ultimately win, but could make the price of winning so catastrophic that America might hesitate before the final invasion of the Japanese home islands. And yet even Kuribayashi's meticulous underground empire could not fully account for what the Americans brought ashore on February 19, 1945, 20 minutes after the first marine assault wave touched the volcanic sand of Iwo Jima's beaches. The Seabees landed with their equipment. The bulldozers came off the landing craft with the tracks still turning. The Marines who fought at Peleliu in September of 1944 had encountered the logic of the Japanese underground defense system at its most elaborate and most terrible. The Umur Brogol Mountains at the center of that small island contained approximately 500 limestone caves, many of them former mine shafts that Japanese military engineers had expanded, reinforced, connected, and converted into an interconnected fortress of staggering complexity. The caves had ventilated storage rooms, medical facilities, ammunition dumps, and hardened firing ports cut at angles designed to make them nearly impervious to direct fire or grenade assault. The garrison that waited inside those caves, under Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had been ordered to fight from them until there was no one left to fight, not to counterattack, not to charge the beaches in banzai rushes that spent lives with no tactical return, to stay in the earth and wait, and bleed the Marines one at a time from positions that could not be easily killed. 400 Seabees landed with the 1st Marine Division on September 15, 1944. They came under the same fire that had already begun to shred the Marine assault waves. The beach at Peleliu was one of the most violently defended landing zones in the Pacific War, and the Seabees were not Marines. They were construction workers in uniform, men whose expertise was in grading coral and leveling airstrips, and not an infantry assault, but they had their equipment, and their equipment turned out to matter in ways that the Japanese defenders had not anticipated. The battle for Peleliu lasted 73 days. The expected timeline had been 3 to 4. The Umurbrogol Pocket, the last concentrated Japanese resistance in the mountains, held out through October and into November as the Americans tried every available instrument of destruction: artillery, naval gunfire, airstrikes, flamethrowers, demolition charges placed by hand at the mouths of caves at enormous cost in blood. None of these methods was efficient. None of them was decisive on its own. The bulldozer was different. When the armored D7s and D8s were brought up to the cave entrances, and this was work that required the operators to drive under direct fire through terrain that had been designed to funnel them into ambush, the effect was a kind of geological revenge. The blade would be lowered, and the diesel engine would engage its full torque, and the earth that Japanese soldiers had spent weeks or months cutting and shaping into a fortress would be folded back on itself, packing the entrances shut with the same volcanic and limestone material that had been excavated to make them. A cave that 100 men could not fill by hand could be sealed in minutes by a single machine. The Japanese soldiers inside had prepared themselves to die fighting, as they had not prepared themselves to be entombed. The Japanese had built their psychological and military strategy around the assumption that dying in battle was a form of victory, that the willingness to die would, in the end, constitute a kind of spiritual superiority that no material force could overcome. The Senjin-kun had promised them that. Bushido had promised them that. The entire intellectual architecture of the Japanese military state had been constructed on that foundation. Yet what the bulldozer revealed, and what the Japanese commanders who observed its work in the field found themselves unable to fully process, was that willingness to die was not by itself a strategy. It was a posture. And a posture, however sincere, however courageous, however religiously committed, could be buried. There are accounts in captured Japanese documents, in the diaries of Japanese officers recovered from Pacific battlefields, of the specific psychological impact that American mechanized warfare had on men who had been trained to believe that spirit could overcome material. A Japanese officer who had survived the fighting on Guadalcanal wrote in his diary, later recovered and translated by American intelligence, "Their firepower had overwhelmed us, and we had put too much confidence in our charging." It was not a statement of cowardice, while it was a statement of revelation, the recognition that a doctrine built on human will had encountered something that human will alone could not address. You could not charge a bulldozer and win. You could not outrun it, or outlast it, or frighten it, or persuade it. You could not appeal to its sense of honor. It had no sense of honor to appeal to. It had a diesel engine and 40 tons of operational weight and a blade designed to move the earth. The factories of Peoria, Illinois, did not pause to consider the philosophy of Bushido. They ran 2 shifts a day, then 3. The Caterpillar plant on the east bank of the Illinois River, the main production facility, the one that won the Army-Navy E Award in February 1943 and added production excellence stars in May 1944, November 1944, and June 1945, produced tractors at a rate that no accounting of individual courage could keep pace with. In 1944 alone, Caterpillar built 18,193 crawler tractors. In 1945, and before the end of the war halted production, another 19,444 were completed. By the end of the war, Caterpillar had fulfilled military contracts worth $570,578,000. Nearly $600 million of earth-moving capacity poured into the Pacific and European theaters at a tempo Japan's own industrial base, laboring under raw material shortages and strategic bombing, could not approach. Japan's steel production, even at its wartime peak, was less than a tenth of America's. Its oil reserves were essentially non-existent without the captured fields of the Dutch East Indies, which were increasingly inaccessible as the American submarine campaign strangled the sea lanes. The Japanese war economy was a structure built on substitution and sacrifice and the assumption that spirit could compensate for scarcity. It was a structure that had worked for a time, in the early campaigns of conquest when the war was moving fast. It had never been designed to sustain a grinding, a nutritional campaign across thousands of miles of open ocean against an industrial power that could produce, as a matter of routine, more steel and fuel and machines and food and ammunition in a single month than Japan could produce in a year. American industry provided nearly two-thirds of all Allied military equipment produced during the entire war. 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, and millions of tons of food, medicine, fuel, and raw material, and tens of thousands of bulldozers shipped across the Pacific in the holds of Liberty ships, offloaded onto beaches under fire, driven by men who were machinists and ironworkers and union carpenters who had never expected to be anywhere near a combat zone, and who found themselves using the tools of their peacetime trade as instruments of war in ways that their training had never fully anticipated. Yet the Seabees built 400 advanced naval bases across the Pacific during the war. They built 100 airstrips. They graded and surfaced 235,000 miles of road, a distance greater than the circumference of the Earth times 9. They erected housing for 1.5 million men and constructed storage tanks for 100 million gallons of aviation fuel, all of it built in the teeth of Japanese resistance. Chipped under mortar fire and sniper fire and occasional direct infantry assault on terrain that had never been intended for construction of any kind. They suffered more than 200 combat deaths and earned more than 2,000 Purple Hearts. They earned 33 Silver Stars and 5 Navy Crosses. And every advance they made, every airstrip they leveled, every road they cut through jungle, that's every cave mouth they sealed with a blade of steel, extended the physical reach of American power deeper into what Japan had believed to be its defensive perimeter. The transformation that the Armored Bulldozer represented was not merely tactical, it was philosophical. And the Japanese officers who had the clarity or the misfortune to perceive it understood something that the official doctrine of the Imperial Army could not acknowledge without undermining its own foundations. The Japanese defense of the Pacific Islands had been built on a specific assumption about the nature of the contest. It assumed that the battle would be fought between soldiers, between human beings, and that in a contest between human beings, the quality of the spirit could ultimately determine the outcome. The Japanese soldier, trained from childhood to understand himself as a servant of the emperor and an embodiment of a divine national inheritance, and had been conditioned to believe that his inner resources were deeper, his willingness to sacrifice greater, his commitment to the mission more absolute than anything a conscript army drawn from a democratic, commercial society could produce. The fortification was simply the physical expression of that spiritual commitment, the bunker as manifestation of will. The bulldozer dissolved that assumption at the level of physics. It did not engage the Japanese soldier's spirit, and it did not honor it by fighting it directly. It simply went around it, or over it, or under it, and rearranged the earth in which that spirit had embedded itself. The cave mouths that months of labor had carved into volcanic rock were sealed in minutes. The pillboxes of log and sand that 100 men could not have dismantled by hand were crushed in seconds. And the defensive works that represented the concentrated engineering genius and physical sacrifice of a Japanese garrison were negated not by superior courage, but by superior horsepower. There are documented accounts of Japanese officers who, after observing what American armored bulldozers could do to their defensive positions, expressed a specific and precise despair that went beyond military calculation. Not the despair of a soldier who has been outfought, but the despair of a believer whose faith has been tested by a fact that faith cannot refute. One Japanese commander, surveying the sealed entrances of positions that had taken his men months to build, was reported to have observed, in language that his own military code would barely permit, that it was impossible to compete with this level of industrial power. Not military power, industrial power. The distinction was everything. Military power could be countered with military power. Yet industrial power existed at a different level of reality, where the units of measurement were not courage or willpower, but tonnage and horsepower, and the number of factories running 3 shifts a day in Peoria, Illinois. At Iwo Jima, the terrible final logic of this contest was played out at its most concentrated and most costly. General Kuribayashi had built what was arguably the most sophisticated underground defensive system in the history of warfare up to that point. The tunnels ran 18 kilometers or more through the volcanic rock of the island. The caves were stocked with food and ammunition sufficient for months of resistance. The garrison of 21,000 men had been ordered to die in place, not to waste lives in charges or counterattacks, but to remain underground, to emerge only when the American advance presented a target, to exact the maximum cost in American lives before the island was finally taken. But Kuribayashi had done the arithmetic of the coming battle with a cold-eyed precision that was almost modern in its detachment, and the arithmetic had told him that his garrison would die. The question was, how many Americans would die with them? The Seabees of the 133rd Naval Construction Battalion landed on the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima 20 minutes after the first Marine assault wave touched the beach on February 19, 1945. They were immediately under fire. The soft volcanic sand refused to support wheeled vehicles, and the equipment had to be used from the moment of landing, not to build, but to haul, to clear, to carve paths through terrain that seemed designed to swallow machinery. The 133rd NCB would ultimately suffer 328 casualties in the fighting on Iwo Jima, including 42 killed, the highest casualty count endured by any construction battalion unit in the entire war. But even as the fighting continued across the island's tortured terrain, the Seabees were working. They repaired the captured airfields under mortar fire. They prepared runways for crippled B-29 superfortresses returning from bombing runs over Japan, aircraft that might have been lost at sea if the airfield on Iwo Jima had not been operational. And their bulldozers, where the terrain permitted them to operate, had performed at the cave entrances and bunker positions the same geological equation that had been written for the first time on a beach in the Solomon Islands 14 months before. The Marines who fought at Iwo Jima developed standard procedures for dealing with the cave network. Demolitions men ran from entrance to entrance, packing explosive charges against the rock. Flamethrower teams burned deep into the tunnels. And where the bulldozers could be brought up, guided by operators who knew they were driving through the sites of surviving Japanese positions, the blades came down and the earth moved and the cave entrances closed. For the Japanese soldiers entombed in those sealed positions, the experience defied every category of death that the Senjin-kun had prepared them for. They had been trained to die with a weapon in their hands, facing the enemy, in an act that Bushido could frame as honorable. Yet the sealed cave offered no such framing. There was no charge, no last exchange of fire, no moment of beautiful self-destruction. There was only darkness and silence, and the sound of the blade working outside, receding as the operator moved to the next position. Gyokusai, shattering like a jewel, required an audience. It required the enemy to witness the sacrifice. The bulldozer simply buried the sacrifice along with the sacrifice itself. Yet the recurring symbol in the drama of the Pacific War, The object that appears again and again in every account, in every island campaign, from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima, is the steel blade. Not the rifle, not the grenade, not the flamethrower, though all of these were present and all did their work. The steel blade of the bulldozer was the thing that most precisely measured the distance between the world Japan had imagined it was fighting and the world it was actually fighting. As the blade moved Earth, it did not negotiate with Earth, it did not ask Earth's permission. It simply engaged the physical reality of the ground and reorganized it according to the priorities of the operator and the requirements of the mission. In doing so, it made visible, in 3 dimensions, the absolute material difference between the 2 nations that had gone to war. Since Japan had asked its soldiers to become the equivalent of that blade, to be the instrument that reshaped the battlefield through the sheer force of spiritual commitment. The Senjin-kun had told them that the spirit of Japan was a blade that could cut through any material resistance. But a blade made of spirit, however sharp, cannot do the work of 24 tons of diesel-powered steel. It cannot fill bomb craters fast enough to keep runways open. And it cannot seal 500 caves in the limestone mountains of a Pacific island. It cannot build in 9 days the airstrip that allows American fighters to push their reach 300 miles further into what was once Japanese airspace. The steel blade appeared on the beaches of Bora Bora in February 1942, buried in the holds of supply ships, hauled ashore by men smelling of sweat and diesel fuel who had come from places like Milford, Massachusetts, and Peoria, Illinois, and who carried with them the accumulated mechanical inheritance of a society that had spent a century learning to build things faster and bigger and more efficiently than anyone else on Earth. It appeared at Guadalcanal, repairing the airstrip of Henderson Field between Japanese bombing raids, filling craters that were opened faster than they could be filled and filling them anyway. It appeared at the Treasury Islands in the hands of Aurelio Tassone, who had named it Helen, and who took it forward through machine gun fire with the calm efficiency of a man who understood that 24 tons of iron is not afraid of bullets. It appeared at Peleliu and at Saipan and at Guam and at Tinian and at Iwo Jima and at every island in between, and at every island it said the same thing in the same language of grinding steel tracks and diesel exhaust and moving earth, that the war Japan had planned to fight was not the war that had arrived. The war ended in August 1945, what sealed by 2 events that made the blade of the bulldozer seem, by comparison, almost gentle. The atomic detonations over Hiroshima and Nagasaki that removed the question of American industrial capacity from the realm of debate and placed it in the realm of physical law. Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, aboard the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, and the surrender was a document signed not only in acknowledgement of military defeat, but in recognition of something that the most prescient Japanese officers had begun to understand as early as 1942, that the contest had never been between soldiers alone. It had been between systems, between philosophies, between 2 entirely different visions of what power was made of and where it came from. The Japanese vision had said that power came from the spirit, from the concentrated, disciplined, sacrificial willingness of a people who had been taught to understand themselves as uniquely suited by history and divine mandate to absorb any suffering the war required of them. There was nobility in that vision, and there was genuine heroism in the men who embodied it, and there was also, at the end, an irreducible tragedy in the discovery that nobility and heroism and spirit, however real and however costly, were not equivalent to the capacity to produce 20,000 D7 bulldozers in 4 years, not equivalent to the capacity to build 400 advanced naval bases and 100 airstrips and 235,000 miles of road on the most hostile terrain on Earth, not equivalent to the capacity of a man from Milford, Massachusetts, is to climb aboard a 24-ton machine he had named for his wife and drive it through machine gun fire toward a fortification that held 12 men who were willing to die inside it, and to seal that fortification shut with its blade, and then turn the machine around and go back to the beach to wait for the next assignment. What Aurelio Tassone did on that beach in the Solomon Islands in October 1943 was not a great battle by the metrics of the Pacific War. 12 men died. As a single pillbox was eliminated, the advance of one infantry brigade resumed. It was, by the scale of the conflict, a footnote. But it was a footnote that contained the entirety of the larger story, the story of a war in which the decisive weapon turned out to be not the most violent, or the most sophisticated, or the most terrible, but the most patient, the most relentless, yet the most indifferent to fear and doctrine and the philosophies of men who had taught themselves to believe that the spirit could outlast the machine. The veterans came home. The Seabees, those 325,000 men who had built roads and runways and harbors and hospital facilities across 4 continents and 300 islands, were discharged and returned to their unions and their construction companies and their families. And the skills they had used to build across the Pacific were redirected to the vast American construction projects of the post-war years. The highways, the subdivisions, the airports, the power plants, the infrastructure of a civilization that was entering on the back of what it had built during the war. The most sustained period of material abundance in human history. The bulldozers were repainted. The olive drab gave way to caterpillar yellow, and the machines that had sealed the cave mouths of Iwo Jima and Peleliu went back to work building the world rather than ending it. The steel blades pushed earth for shopping centers and interstate highways and the foundations of houses in which the children of the men who had driven them across Pacific beaches would grow up without knowing the specific history of the machine in whose shadow their foundations had been poured. Japan rebuilt too, and rebuilt with extraordinary speed, and with the same combination of discipline and collective will that it had once directed toward conquest and now directed toward reconstruction. Within a generation, it would become one of the most productive industrial economies on Earth. The men who had been trained to shatter like jewels for the emperor would, in their post-war lives, build the economic institutions of a society that had learned, at a cost almost beyond calculation, that the wealth of a civilization is measured not in willingness to die but in capacity to build, that the steel blade, in the end, belongs to the future, not to the past, that the earth does not move for the man who is most prepared to sacrifice himself. It moves for the man who has brought the right machine. There is a question, quiet and persistent, yet that attaches itself to this history like smoke to a battlefield after the guns have gone quiet. What is the nature of abundance? Not as an economic concept, but as a moral one. What does it mean that a free society, a society that permitted its citizens to argue and dissent and change their governments and pursue their own definitions of happiness, was capable, when the moment required it, of producing not only more weapons and more machines than its opponents could match, but more Aurelio Tassones? More men who would name a bulldozer after their wives and drive it through machine gun fire not because an emperor had commanded them to, but because their commanding officer had asked them to, and because there was a job that needed doing, and they knew how to do it. Democracy, in the calculus of the Japanese military, was a weakness. The individual who could refuse, who could hesitate, who could ask why, that individual was a fracture in the foundation of military power. But it turned out that the individual who could refuse was also the individual who could decide, without being ordered to pick up the right tool for the right job at the right moment. The individual who understood that a pillbox was a problem and a bulldozer was the solution, and who made that connection between problem and solution in the moment of fire, without waiting for doctrine to authorize it. At the steel blade of the bulldozer, that recurring presence across every island of the Pacific campaign, that olive-drab emblem of American industrial civilization arriving at the edge of every beach, every cave mouth, every fortified ridgeline, was not merely a weapon. It was, in its deepest nature, An argument. It was the argument that a society makes when it has the abundance to deploy not just soldiers, but engineers, not just fighters, but builders. It's not just the will to destroy, but the capacity to construct. It was the argument that freedom makes when it shows up at full industrial weight on a beach where someone has decided that the spirit of a nation is sufficient reason for 12 men to die inside a log and sand bunker rather than step outside it and face the morning. The morning came anyway, in the form of 24 tons of diesel-powered iron named Helen, driven by a machinist's mate from Massachusetts who had a wife waiting at home and a job to finish. The blade came down, the earth moved, and that is how the Pacific War was won.